The statement itself ran under 3 minutes, yet it dismantled expectations the monarchy had held for decades. King Charles stepped into the private council chamber, set a sealed crimson folder in front of Prince William, and named a date few believed would arrive this quickly. William offered no celebration. Catherine remained silent, and once the king disclosed who would shape the ceremony itself, everyone present realized this was more than a coronation notice. It was the opening chapter of a royal goodbye. Before we dive deeper into what all of this really signals for the royal family, be sure to subscribe so nothing slips past you. Charles had called William, Catherine, Queen Camilla, Princess Anne, and senior advisors to Buckingham Palace without offering a reason. No one could tell whether the subject would be security, illness, or the line of succession. That uncertainty mattered because the private council chamber is kept for matters considered too delicate for open discussion. When the monarch finally lifted the folder open, he spoke without hesitation. William's coronation would take place on Saturday, 14th November 2026 at Westminster Abbey, the church where British sovereigns are formally crowned. William did not reach out for the pages. The prince held his father's gaze and asked, "Why now?" Charles lowered his eyes rather than reply. That silence pierced deeper than any spoken reason. The future king recognized that a date this precise had not been picked lightly, and beside him, Catherine felt the same dread. Becoming queen would remake her life, yet it would also drag Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis toward duties they were far too young to grasp. Then Catherine received the second blow. Charles handed her direct authority over the emotional and symbolic architecture of the coronation. The service would not simply place a crown on William, it would define the entire reign to follow. A coronation is the ceremony in which a monarch takes the oath, receives the crown, and formally accepts the burdens of the realm. So granting the princess that influence placed enormous trust in her judgment. Camilla's expression turned rigid when the king added that several parts inherited from the previous coronation would be stripped away. The queen consort tilted forward to protest, but he shut the folder before her words could form. Anne watched everything closely. She sensed the decision had opened a wound that would not stay concealed for long. William at last laid a hand on the crimson cover but declined to lift it. Catherine rested her fingers gently on his wrist, offering strength without speaking. Charles studied them with unmistakable sorrow. Then Anne caught sight of a second sealed envelope tucked beneath his chair, bearing William's initials and the note, "To be opened privately." The date had already been declared, but the greater revelation still lay hidden inside an envelope Charles could not bring himself to open before the family. Behind that announcement stood 4 people wrestling with 4 different fears. Charles was losing the role he had waited his entire life to receive. William faced a crown arriving before he felt prepared for its weight. Catherine faced the transformation of her children's world, and Camilla faced the possibility that the monarchy's next chapter was already being written without her name on the page. Inside one silent chamber, duty drew them close while personal grief threatened to pull them apart. William walked out of the council chamber without breaking the seal on the second envelope. The prince had spent years sitting through constitutional briefings, poring over state papers, and studying how a sovereign must behave when pressure mounts. Yet all that preparation had always seemed abstract. Now the confirmed coronation date had transformed every one of those lessons into a countdown. Kingship was no longer some far-off duty. It had become a fixed appointment waiting for him on 14th November. Catherine followed him into a private corridor and waited until the doors were sealed behind them. The princess had already shouldered larger duties in fragile moments before, but taking charge of the coronation placed her at the heart of the monarchy's most sacred transition. A coronation is the formal service where a sovereign takes an oath and receives the crown, which makes the ceremony both a public vow and a passing of responsibility. She understood that every single choice would carry meaning. William tightened his grip on the sealed envelope and admitted the date felt less like an honor and more like a warning. Catherine responded with quiet firmness. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis would detect his fear before anyone else did. If he let panic take hold, their children would begin fearing the crown too. Her words steadied him, but they could not erase the dread. Charles returned alone to his study and removed his spectacles. The king glanced toward a framed photograph of his sons, and pride tangled with regret inside him. He had prepared William to rule, yet succession had quietly worked its way into every conversation the two of them shared. Father and son could no longer talk about tomorrow without feeling the weight of the crown pressing between them. Camilla soon discovered that she would hold no formal authority over the reshaped ceremony. The queen consort would attend and carry out her expected public duties, but Catherine would decide the music, the family placement, the tributes, and the royal symbols. She walked into Charles's study without warning and asked whether he had already begun writing her out of the future. Charles slowly set his pen down. The monarch acknowledged her pain, yet refused to unmake the decision. Before Camilla could reply, Princess Anne caught up with William and told him the date had not been picked out of convenience. It was tied to a private promise made after an earlier family crisis. William finally broke the seal. Inside waited a single handwritten line. This date became inevitable after what happened at Windsor. To understand why Charles had accelerated the transfer of the crown, William would have to revisit the night the monarchy nearly lost its grip on its own future. Months before that date was ever put on paper, one private ceremony at Windsor Castle changed the direction of the monarchy. It had been intended as a discreet rehearsal for future continuity, a symbolic assembly shielded from cameras and public commentary. Instead, it laid bare hesitation, rivalry, and an unsettling lack of readiness. By the time Charles left the room, he had witnessed enough. The crown could no longer rely on assumptions. A date had to be locked in, and William had to be prepared. Charles had staged the Windsor continuity ceremony to test how the senior family would respond if the monarch suddenly became unable to fulfill a major state obligation. A continuity ceremony is a private rehearsal designed to make sure royal responsibilities can transfer smoothly during an emergency. William thought it was purely a controlled exercise. Catherine sensed something more layered. The king was watching for discipline, loyalty, and control of emotion. William entered the gathering, intending to follow his father's lead, not overshadow it. The prince listened while advisors walked through a fictional scenario of canceled appearances, delayed state papers, and urgent constitutional decisions. Then, one senior court official put the question that unraveled everything. Who would lead if Charles could no longer perform his duty? Camilla stepped forward before William could open his mouth. The queen consort declared that no transition should occur without her approval. Her tone stayed calm, but the meaning detonated across the room. Charles looked at her in disbelief. He had anticipated worry, maybe fear. He had not anticipated a claim of authority. William held his silence out of respect. Catherine spotted the danger at once. His restraint was being mistaken for indecision, and that misreading could split the palace during a real crisis. Camilla held her position while the future king refused to challenge his father's wife in front of the entire room. Charles confronted William in a side chamber once the ceremony ended. The king pressed him to explain why he had not asserted himself. The prince replied that he would never battle Camilla for authority while his father was still standing. His words carried loyalty, yet they also exposed the fragility of leaving succession undefined. Catherine walked in moments later and spoke without hesitation. The princess told Charles that William's silence was not weakness, it was loyalty. She warned that dragging out the transition would let others build influence around him before he was ready to defend his own position. Charles slipped off his signet ring, the personal seal used to mark royal authority, and placed it on the table between himself and William. "One day, silence will no longer protect you," he said. That very night, the monarch instructed his private secretary, through a recorded planning memo, to prepare a fixed coronation timetable. He also installed Catherine at the head of the Ceremonial Planning Council, the group responsible for shaping the service itself. Camilla eventually learned, through that documented account, that Windsor had shaped the date. She demanded a private meeting with Catherine. The rehearsal had revealed the fracture, but the confrontation ahead would force Catherine to defend the future crown without William at her side. There were no advisors in the room, no secretaries scribbling notes, and no husbands standing between them. Catherine and Camilla faced one another as two women bound to the same crown, yet split over what its future should embody. One believed continuity required control. The other believed survival required change. Their conversation began with ceremony arrangements, but within minutes it turned into a reckoning over loyalty, legacy, and who truly held the king's confidence. Camilla had requested the meeting at Clarence House after learning that Catherine held final authority over several coronation traditions. Clarence House was the royal residence used by the king and queen consort before Charles's accession, which made it a deeply personal setting for the confrontation. The queen expected paperwork, legal notes, perhaps even an advisor waiting nearby. Instead, the princess arrived alone and empty-handed. She intended to speak as a future queen, not shelter behind palace procedure. Camilla opened with accusation. She told Catherine that the new plans were letting Charles erase his own reign before it had ended. The queen consort argued that every discarded tradition weakened the dignity of the crown he still wore. Catherine did not step back. She answered that preparing William was not an attack on the king. It was protection against the chaos Windsor had already put on display. The argument grew sharper. Camilla said Catherine could never understand the sacrifices required to endure life inside the monarchy. She spoke of years of hostility, isolation, and public scrutiny, insisting that endurance had earned her a voice in the future. The princess listened, then gave the reply that shifted the entire room. Survival alone, she said, could not become the institution's guiding purpose. Camilla then demanded prominent seating for her family and a formal ceremonial role during the service. A ceremonial role is an official place within the coronation that publicly signals status, loyalty, and importance. Catherine refused. She explained that the event would center on constitutional continuity, meaning the lawful passage of royal responsibility from Charles to William, rather than private reward for relatives. Catherine finally revealed the source of her authority. Through a signed planning instruction logged after the Windsor confrontation, Charles had personally ordered the removal of a disputed procession segment. The king had made the call himself. Camilla could no longer dismiss it as the princess's ambition. Camilla pushed her chair back and asked whether Catherine intended to become queen before the crown ever touched her head. The princess rose, paused at the door, and answered, "No, I intend to be ready when it does." Within hours, the queen consort went straight to Charles and demanded that he reverse the decision. Catherine had defended the ceremony in private, but the king would now have to defend her against the woman seated beside him on the throne. For years, Charles had balanced love against duty, often persuading himself that the two could coexist. But when Camilla challenged Catherine's authority, that balance collapsed. The king could protect his wife from humiliation, or he could protect William's transition from interference. He could not do both. In the silence of his private office, the monarch who had spent a lifetime waiting for power discovered that his hardest decision would involve surrendering it. Camilla reached Charles moments after leaving Catherine. The queen consort demanded that he revise the ceremonial authority structure before the arrangements went public. That structure was the formal chain of command deciding who could approve, reject, or change parts of the coronation. She argued that letting Catherine dominate the process would make the present reign look weak before it had even ended. The king listened, but the pain in her voice did not soften the risk in her request. Charles admitted her fear was real. The monarch knew she had endured years of hostility, suspicion, and public judgment at his side. Yet he also knew the crown could not be governed by reassurance. Camilla told him Catherine's rising authority made her feel like a guest inside the reign she had helped him survive. He answered with quiet force. The future could not be delayed simply to make the present feel safer. Princess Anne joined Charles later and found him still seated beside the unsigned order. She warned that every unclear instruction bred rival centers of influence around William. A transition schedule, she explained, is a formal plan for moving duties from one sovereign to the next in controlled stages. Without firm boundaries, advisors, relatives, and private households could all start competing for access to the future king. Charles struggled to say the truth aloud. Confirming William's coronation date was not a rejection of his own reign. It was his final responsibility as monarch and as father. The king had waited decades for the crown, but clutching it too tightly now could leave his son surrounded by confusion. Anne told him hesitation would not preserve his legacy. It would erode it. Charles signed the order. The document confirmed that Catherine's ceremonial decisions could be overruled only by William or the king, not by Camilla, courtiers, extended relatives, or outside advisors. He held the paper for several seconds before sliding it across the desk. Camilla read the first paragraph and closed the folder. The queen consort lifted her hand from his without speaking. Charles did not stop her. The silence between them carried the cost of the decision, and then he confirmed, through the signed transition plan, that the king would step back from his public duties in stages before November 14th. When the news reached William, the prince understood the deeper truth. His father was not simply preparing a ceremony, he was beginning a deliberate withdrawal from royal power. The signature settled the question of authority, but it also triggered the first visible consequences of a reign approaching its end. The shift began quietly. Briefing folders were rerouted. Meetings once led by Charles began appearing under William's name. Staff who had served one reign for decades were told to begin preparing for another. No public proclamation could disguise what was unfolding inside the palace. Power had started to move before the coronation. For Charles, each transferred duty felt like a fragment of his identity being taken away. For William, each new responsibility carried the weight of his father's approaching absence. Royal staff received the phased transition schedule within hours of the signed order. The plan handed over security briefings, Commonwealth consultations, charitable oversight, and selected state responsibilities to William in controlled stages. Commonwealth consultations are formal discussions with nations that share historic ties to the crown, making them a serious test of royal authority. The prince understood why the schedule mattered, yet he hated how quickly officials began treating his father like a man already gone. William corrected them more than once. The future king insisted that Charles remained the sovereign until the final moment, and that no new title, chair, or briefing order could rewrite that fact. His frustration grew each time a courtier looked past the king and waited for his answer instead. Succession was arriving, but it felt cruel. Every sign of William's rise seemed to demand another visible surrender from his father. Catherine pressed ahead with the coronation plans, building the ceremony around service, national unity, and family continuity. The princess trimmed the guest list and rejected empty displays of status. She also chose Prince George for a historic supporting role that would identify him as the next generation of succession without laying the same burden on Princess Charlotte or Prince Louis. George would take part, while the younger children would be shielded. Camilla answered with silence. The queen consort withdrew from 2 planning sessions and instructed her private household not to speak directly with Catherine's team without permission. Her decision slowed the arrangements and deepened the divide. Catherine refused to retaliate, but she registered the warning. Camilla had lost formal control, yet she was not ready to accept the new order without protest. Charles walked into a scheduled briefing expecting routine discussion. The king stopped when he noticed that his usual chair had been nudged slightly aside, while William's seat sat squarely at the center of the table. No insult had been announced, none was necessary. The placement spoke plainly. William saw his father's face and acted before anyone else could react. The prince slid the chair back beside his own and said, "I will not begin by pushing you away." Charles looked at him for several long seconds, then took his seat. For one brief moment, the crown did not divide them. That evening, the monarch asked William to meet him alone at Windsor. Catherine would not join. Camilla would not be invited. Anne and every court official would remain outside. The machinery of succession was already turning. But the future king still needed one thing no document could give him: a final, honest word from his father. No crown, uniform, or council stood between them. Charles and William met not as sovereign and heir, but as father and son wrestling with the price of duty. For years, each had spoken through protocol, responsibility, and carefully rationed emotion. Now there was no institution left to shield them from honesty. Charles revealed why he had settled on the date, what he feared most, and why Catherine's role truly mattered. William's response transformed the coronation from a transfer of power into an act of reconciliation. Charles had chosen a small private room at Windsor Castle, where he and William had once talked about royal duty in the days after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. The king knew the space carried memories neither man could ignore. No aides waited outside the door, and no official palace account would ever record what was said. An official palace account is the written record used to preserve formal royal decisions, but this conversation would belong to father and son alone. William walked in, still carrying the weight of the transition schedule. The prince expected instructions. Instead, Charles confessed fear. He had worried that waiting too long would leave his son surrounded by confusion, divided loyalties, and family battles that should have been resolved years earlier. The monarch had witnessed what uncertainty produced at Windsor, and he refused to let hesitation become William's inheritance. Charles then explained the date. 14th November marked the anniversary of a private promise he had made years earlier. During a conversation no courtier had overheard, the king had told William that when the crown finally drew near, his son would not be caught unprepared. Naming the date was his way of keeping that promise before time or crisis could snatch the choice away. William broke his own silence. The future king admitted that becoming monarch was not his deepest fear. He feared allowing the crown to make him emotionally distant from Catherine, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. Duty had already taken pieces of their private life. He could not accept a reign that demanded the rest. Charles understood. The monarch said Catherine had been chosen to guide the ceremony because she respected royal history without ignoring the family living inside it. Her role was not merely decorative. She would protect the people entering the next reign from being swallowed by the institution around them. Charles slipped a small, handwritten card from his pocket. It held the coronation oath he had once feared taking, the solemn promise a sovereign makes to serve the nation and uphold the law. He placed it in William's hand and said, "Do not inherit my fear with my crown." William took the card, then set one condition. He would accept the date only if his father walked into Westminster Abbey, not as a defeated monarch, but as the man who secured the succession. Charles agreed. The palace began preparing the public announcement. Father and son had finally reached peace. But beyond the palace walls, millions were about to decide for themselves what William's coronation meant to them. At precisely 8 o'clock, palace communications released the date. Within minutes, television schedules changed, newspaper presses restarted, and crowds began gathering outside royal landmarks. The announcement carried celebration, anxiety, grief, and fascination in equal measure. Britain was not merely preparing for another coronation. It was confronting the closing of one reign while watching a younger family step into history. And one public image would soon come to represent everything the nation was feeling. Buckingham Palace confirmed that William would be crowned on the 14th of November, that Catherine would guide the ceremony, and that Charles would transfer selected responsibilities in carefully controlled stages. A phased transfer means duties move gradually rather than passing all at once, allowing the monarch and heir to share responsibility during the transition. The announcement mattered because it gave the nation certainty, but it also made the closing of the current reign feel painfully real. Broadcasters called it the most significant planned royal transition in generations. They repeated one crucial point: Charles remained king until the coronation. Yet every discussion carried the same emotional split. Supporters praised William and Catherine as symbols of stability and renewal. Others felt sorrow for the monarch who had waited so long to reign, only to begin preparing his farewell sooner than expected. Camilla watched the first television bulletin alone. The Queen Consort listened as the presenter praised Catherine's historic authority and described the princess as the architect of the new ceremony. She reached for the remote and lowered the volume, but she did not leave. Her silence revealed more than anger. It carried the grief of someone watching the future take shape without her control. Catherine received the public reaction with calm, but the princess understood the danger of celebration turning into triumph over Charles. Through the official palace statement, she confirmed that Prince George would take part in the service. His role would create a visible link between 3 generations of kingship, while shielding Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis from ceremonial pressure. The statement also disclosed a private family pledge before the public service. Charles, William, and George would stand together before entering Westminster Abbey. The pledge would not transfer legal power. It would express continuity, trust, and family loyalty before the crown changed hands. Outside Buckingham Palace, one moment captured the nation's emotion. A young boy raised a handmade sign that read, "Thank you, King Charles. We are ready, William." The image spread across television networks and dominated the next morning's front pages. One newspaper printed Charles on one side and William with Catherine on the other. Across the center ran the headline, "The crown passes with a father's blessing." As public emotion reached its height, the royal family gathered one final time. The world had already declared the moment historic, but only the family could decide whether it would be remembered as an ending, a victory, or an act of love. In the end, the coronation date did not stand for Charles losing his crown or William seizing it. It stood for a father choosing to give his son what he himself had rarely received: certainty, preparation, and an open blessing. Catherine's ceremony became the bridge between two reigns, carrying the dignity of the past without being chained to it. The conflict, fear, and rivalry had tested the family, but one final gathering revealed what the transition truly meant. Catherine walked into the music room at Buckingham Palace carrying the completed coronation framework. The princess knew this was more than a ceremony plan. A coronation framework is the formal structure that decides how the service will unfold, who will take part, and what each moment will represent. Her design honored Charles's reign, established William's leadership, recognized her own duty, and shielded Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis from pressure they were not ready to carry. Camilla studied the final pages in silence. The queen consort had once believed Catherine's authority was designed to push her aside, but the completed plan proved otherwise. Her place remained dignified, though clearly limited. She did not offer a warm apology. She simply agreed to support the ceremony without further resistance. It was not affection, but it was acceptance. And after everything that had divided them, that mattered. William turned to his father and thanked him for locking in the date before uncertainty could splinter the family. The prince admitted that any delay might have let fear, ambition, and private influence grow around the succession. Charles answered that preparing his son properly would become the most important act of his reign. The king had spent years waiting to inherit the crown. Now his final triumph would be handing it over with order and dignity. Catherine then revealed the ceremony's most personal detail through the signed final program. The princess had reserved the final words before William entered Westminster Abbey for Charles alone. The outgoing monarch would tell his son that the crown passed with his full consent and blessing. No advisor would speak. No courtier would stand between them. Father and son would face that moment together. Catherine placed the completed plan on the table. Charles signed beneath her name. William added his signature beside his father's. Camilla signed last, and Princess Anne closed the folder, ending the dispute that had threatened to tear the palace apart. Prince George entered after the meeting and asked William whether becoming king meant everything would change. The future monarch knelt beside him and answered, "Our duty will change, our family will not." The confirmed date became proof that the monarchy had chosen compassion over confusion and unity over rivalry. Charles was not remembered as a king pushed aside. He was remembered as the father who prepared the future before the future demanded it. There would be no further battle over the date, the ceremony, or the succession. On 14th November 2026, William would walk toward the crown with Catherine beside him and King Charles's blessing behind him. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.